Hi everyone, my name is Mark Larkin. I'm the CEO of Vitaccess and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar on digital endpoints and HEOR. So welcome, got a great turnout today, so I think that speaks to how relevant and hopefully interesting this topic is. Let me go straight ahead with some housekeeping items. Just to let you know, there's, I guess many of you will be familiar with the interface, but we've got questions functionality. So any attendees, please feel free to drop us questions as we proceed. We've got, as you'll see, we've got a Q&A at the end, but don't wait till the Q&A to submit your questions. Let me go to if we can go to the next slide. Let me just quickly introduce you to our esteemed panelists. We've got a great panel here today. Giles Monnikendam is Director of HEOR at Vitaccess, and he's going to be main presenter today. We're also delighted to have Kai Langle, who's Director at Janssen Clinical Innovation. And as he'll explain, he's got a pretty long pedigree in digital measures of various types. And so, excellent panel to be able to talk about this subject today. Let me just tell you what the agenda looks like. If you go to the next slide, Giles. I just give a very quick introduction to our company at Vitaccess to just give you a little bit of context for why we're so interested in this topic and the work we're doing in it. Then I'm going to pass it over to Giles and Kai, and they're going to take you through the main body of the webinar about digital endpoints and HEOR. And then we've got a chunk of time at the end as well, because we really thought it would be valuable to do this in a pretty interactive way. So we'll come back for a panel Q&A, and we'll go through the questions that we get throughout the session. So I think that's pretty much it. I'm going to pass over to Giles, who's going to start the next section of the webinar. Oh, sorry, apologies. After me, I forgot my bit. Quick intro to Vitaccess. So yeah, sorry about that. So we're a company of about 50 people, and we're an innovative research organization. So that means we use technology in various different ways to do the work we accomplish. So you see there the different parts of our company. Got a real world evidence team that does digital global studies, an analytics team, consulting team, HEOR, market access, patient-centered outcomes, and a localization team. Typically the projects we do are global, so that enables us to do projects pretty much any country and any language. If you want to go to the next one, Giles. Just to say, we've got our own platform actually, so we call Vitaccess Real, which we've built ourselves, that enables us to very flexibly, globally generate data from patients, from caregivers, from clinicians, in a modular way, as you see in the middle, and then using real-time dashboards, we can explore data very nicely, we think, and give access to different people. So go on to the next one. And yeah, just for these digital studies that we do, we think they're pretty powerful. We get lots of different use cases. We work very closely with patient advocacy groups, key opinion leaders. We do all the development and the implementation in-house. When we've done that, really powerful international patient cohorts actually is what we can achieve. When you do that, you can get a whole load of nice use cases on the right. So this goes right through from pre-approval right through to post-approval as well. So let us know if you'd like to know any more about that, of course. So Giles, over to you for the main part of the presentation.
Okay, great. I will get started on the main presentation. So we use a wide range of measures and metrics in life sciences to quantify patients' experience and their condition. And we do that in order to measure the impact of disease and the impact of treatments of disease. When these measures are specified as the objective of clinical trials, they're an endpoint. And the FDA's definition of a clinically meaningful and relevant endpoint is one which directly measures how a patient feels, functions, or survives. And examples of that include direct measures of patient symptoms, tests of patient activity or function, health-related quality of life measures, and measures of survival like progression-free survival and overall survival. So although the title of the webinar is Digital Endpoints, our focus is actually a little bit more broad than that, and we're talking about digital endpoints and measures. That's to say, we're interested in the use of digital measures beyond just the setting of clinical trials. So classic clinical endpoints or measures are typically administered in a clinical setting, and they're administered infrequently and for a discrete period of time. We define digital endpoints and measures as meaningful aspects of health that are captured using digital tools or connected technology, typically in the hands of patients. And this kind of technology will include smartphones, other mobile and wearable devices, implantables and ingestibles, and then other forms of remote sensors with wireless protocol to upload data. And then the key characteristics of digital measures are that they use remote data capture, and that allows assessments to be transferred from a clinical setting to a daily life environment. And they involve frequent or continuous measurement, and they typically require a degree of patient engagement or involvement for the regular data capture to be effective. And they will often include multiple attributes, which are then combined or interpreted via an algorithm. Now, this contrasts with classic clinical measures, where typically the measurement takes place in a healthcare setting in controlled conditions, and the measurement is infrequent or at scheduled follow-up times only. The measurement is usually assessed, administered, or supervised by a clinician, and typically the metrics of the assessment will be single, simple, and specific. So the increasing adoption and sophistication of connected sensor technologies using devices such as smartphones and smartwatches provides enormous scope now for digital data capture with patients. As with all data capture, there is potential for poor and effective measures, but the advantages of an appropriate digital measurement are as follows. The first is patient centricity, and that's getting closer to patients to measure the impact of disease and treatments. Then we have objectivity, and so we're now able to directly measure patient activities rather than asking patients to recall or assess themselves within a patient-reported outcome or via a clinician conducting an assessment. Then we have relevance, so remote data capture allows measurement in more environments and circumstances that are more relevant to the patient's daily life and experience with disease. So we measure disease and treatment impact during normal activities in the real world rather than in an artificial assessment in clinical settings. And then next we have richness, so the range, the depth and duration of data capture is significantly expanded, which, if the data is structured and analysed well, can provide a more comprehensive understanding of disease and treatment impact. And all this with digital technology can be done at a low cost. So digital data capture can be very cheap, particularly if it makes use of existing consumer devices owned by patients. So I'm now going to run through a number of examples to try bring to life the contrast between traditional clinical assessments and digital measurements. So first up, we've got the assessment of motor function in neurological conditions. So a well-known and widely used clinical measure to assess motor function is the 6-minute walk test. This involves hospital staff setting up a test track. It's usually in a hospital corridor or in an outside area of a hospital. And you have 2 cones set up each end of the track, and then a chair and some distance markers. And the recommended length of the track or the corridor is 30 meters, and the patient completes repeated laps until they need to sit down or they reach the end of the 6 minutes. And then the total distance that's covered during that 6 minutes or until failure is the final score on the test. And that's really it. But the thing to say is that this is a very artificial setting, and you will have clinical staff on hand, and they're there to offer encouragement. That's a part of the test protocol. And they're there to help as well should the patient need any medical attention, if they're struggling, if they're fatigued, if they feel lightheaded, then the staff will intervene and assist. So it's not clear how strongly a patient's score on this test can be expected to correlate with how they will actually function in their daily life. And then when we think about the alternative with digital measurement, here the alternative is assessing motor function with tools such as a smartphone, a smartwatch, or it could be a clinical grade wearable, a clinical grade pedometer, for example. And this will allow digital capture of walking activity on a continuous basis. And it will allow that in the patient's regular daily environment. And from this data, we can then use a number of measures to assess motor function. And the kind of measures that we might choose or use would include number of steps per day, the total duration of walking episodes per day, walking speed, the frequency of walking episodes per week, and maximum steps or distance per walking episode. So once we start to monitor the activity, there's a wide range of different metrics or measures that we might actually use or target. And so while there's much more complexity in the measures, and also other factors of motor function may influence outcomes, the data is captured in the patient's regular daily life. And then the next example I have is assessment of symptom control in moderate to severe asthma. So in moderate to severe asthma, a commonly used measure in both clinical studies and routine practice to assess symptom control is the Asthma Control Questionnaire. And this is a patient-reported outcome measure where the patients report their own symptoms using a 7-point scale. And patients will complete the questionnaire at fixed intervals, and they'll recall their experience of symptoms over the last week. Now, the symptoms captured within the questionnaire include sleep disturbance, asthma symptoms on waking, limitation of daily activities, shortness of breath, wheezing, and the use of the patient's rescue medication. And then a simple average score across all of those symptoms is just summed up to indicate the degree of symptom control. So the questionnaire does capture a broad range of symptoms experienced during daily life, but fundamentally it relies on the patient's subjective assessment of severity. And it's also relying on the patient accurately recalling over the last week the level of their symptoms. And it will also capture the patient's experience only during that week. They are instructed to only recall the last week's experience. Now, in contrast with this, a digital measurement can provide continuous capture of objective data on patient symptoms. So we're actually assessing the symptoms themselves rather than asking the patients to recall. And we can do that with the use of a smartphone plus a smartwatch or a clinical grade wearable device. And we can measure a number of aspects of sleep quality and activity, and that can include sleep disturbance or efficiency, physical activity on waking, general physical activity level, and we can also measure respiration rate and oxygen saturation. There are also now available connected devices such as smart inhalers and peak flow monitors, and direct measurements using these devices can be supplemented with an electronic diary to record other aspects of living with asthma. So yeah, this illustrates the breadth of the potential objective data capture that can be achieved in a real world setting and with relatively low burden for the patient. Now my next example, my final example, is the assessment of glycemic control in type 1 diabetes. So here the established clinical metric is the level of glycated hemoglobin in the blood, also known as HbA1c. So HbA1c is measured via a blood draw or a finger prick test, which is then either analysed at point of care or at a laboratory. Now, current HbA1c levels, they provide an effective look back over approximately 3 months. So they reflect the average blood glucose levels over that period. And HbA1c is a surrogate endpoint or measure, so it's not a patient-relevant measure on its own. So it doesn't directly measure how a patient functions, feels, or survives. But there is an extensive evidence base that links glycemic control, as measured by the HbA1c metric, to long-term morbidity and mortality in diabetes. But now in recent years, continuous or flash glucose monitoring has been developed for routine management of diabetes. And this involves a subcutaneous tissue sensor in the form of a patch that's worn on the skin that then has wireless data transfer to either a smartphone or a flash monitor that a patient holds over the sensor. And this provides patients with real-time data on their blood glucose levels for their diabetes management. But in doing so, it can also provide a continuous record of blood glucose levels that can be used for research purposes. So now we are not able to just measure the mean level of blood glucose over time, but we can also capture the variability. And so this has led to the adoption of measures such as time in range as a new metric for glycemic control. Alongside that, we can also derive measures such as time below range, time above range. We can extract the standard deviation, and also we can count the occurrence of severe hypoglycemic events. All this can be provided from the sensor and the digital measurement technology. And this can provide a much more comprehensive picture of glycemic control on a daily basis and provide us with insights into the impact on patients' daily lives of experiencing the highs and lows throughout the day. And this itself is not evident just from HbA1c readings alone. So having talked through a few examples of how we can get richer and broader data from using digital measures, where is the opportunity then to add value in health technologies, assessment and market access? So there are two main types of HTA body across different countries, and there are those which make decisions based on clinical effectiveness only, and those which also consider cost effectiveness analysis. Now, both types of HTA body review evidence on the burden of disease and unmet need. For some, this is a part of formal decision-making criteria, but for others, it's a contextual consideration only. Both types of HTA body also assess clinical effectiveness. They review clinical measures and patient-reported outcomes for disease severity and the effectiveness of new health technologies, usually from clinical trial evidence. But that is where the clinical effectiveness HTA bodies stop. They make their decision based only on clinical performance. In contrast, cost effectiveness HTA proceeds to review economic evidence, and usually that involves converting clinical effectiveness into estimates of utility and qualities and estimating impacts on cost to determine cost effectiveness. So if we think of these as the three key evidence domains for HTA, then there are opportunities for digital measurement to add value across all three. So that's the burden of disease and unmet need, clinical effectiveness, and the cost effectiveness domain. Now, firstly, digital measurement can provide a much better characterization of burden of disease in HTA evidence submissions. So digital measurement in real-world settings can provide the data for a much more detailed picture to be formed of the impact of the disease on patients. And this can lead to new perspectives on overall disease severity and how to categorize patients. As an example, two patients with type 1 diabetes may have very similar levels of HbA1c, indicating that they've got equivalent glycemic control. But with digital measurement, we may reveal that one patient has much greater daily variability, and that may make their daily life living with diabetes much more burdensome, as they'll experience frequent highs and lows which compromise their daily activities. The breadth and the frequency of digital measurement also means that we've got the potential to provide new evidence on natural history of disease. And this can be particularly valuable in HTA where surrogate endpoints are being used. So it allows us to make clearer links between treatment impact on a surrogate and the expected impact on a patient-relevant outcome. Digital measurements can also make it easier to demonstrate therapeutic benefit in HTA assessments. So, for example, we've talked about the 6-minute walk test and the artificial nature of the test, where patients are in a controlled environment with assistance and encouragement. And this may mean that the test itself is less sensitive to changes in motor function than perhaps a digital measurement of real-world walking activity. So switching to a digital measurement, we may detect effects that previously were not being picked up by something such as the 6-minute walk test. Digital measures can also provide new insights into the heterogeneity of clinical effectiveness. So more detailed or more frequent measurement may reveal that patients are benefiting from treatment in different ways. So we sometimes see changes in simple clinical metrics that are not mirrored in changes in self-assessed health-related quality of life instruments. And digital measurement in the real world may provide more explanations for that. And then when we come on to the cost effectiveness domain, cost effectiveness models are typically based on disease models that use health states. And digital measurement may allow more detailed and more accurate modeling of those health states. So with our diabetes example, we may now be able to distinguish between patients with the same HbA1c, but different variability, and model their health-related quality of life and costs separately, rather than combined and aggregated. And then finally, digital measurement allows us to generate richer and more accurate data on health-related quality of life and health resource utilization. So with digital technology, we can sample patients much more frequently in their daily environment and after important trigger events, so that we can then build a more detailed picture on disease, treatments received, and the impact on patients. So for example, geolocation data can allow us to capture data on hospitalizations for severe asthma exacerbation. And it will also allow us to collect health-related quality of life data directly around this event. So we've seen how digital endpoints can be, we've seen digital endpoints so far used in a number of clinical trials, but we're a long way from widespread adoption. And there are some important challenges to be addressed if we were to get there at any great pace. So, these challenges are that, first up, that new endpoints and measures will need to be formally validated to demonstrate that what is being measured is consistent, meaningful, and can be reliably interpreted in the context of the disease. There is also a more subjective step in achieving understanding and acceptance among key decision makers. So regulators, payers, and clinicians have got years of experience with established measures, and they may consider that even though those measures might be flawed, those flaws are at least well understood, in contrast to potential new digital measures, which is something of an unknown quantity. And then perhaps a little bit more rationally, some stakeholders are particularly concerned with backward consistency in decisions. So for example, if a new digital measurement recalibrates the assessments of disease severity or highlights an important treatment effect that was previously unidentified, HDA bodies may feel compelled to go back and revisit past decisions on similar technologies or in similar indications. And then finally, for digital measurements to be widely adopted, they must be readily available across a range of technology platforms. And this will require detailed specifications, standard setting, and confirmation of consistency across those multiple technology platforms. At this point, I'll now hand over to Kai Langle to talk a little bit more about something called DEEP.
Yeah, thanks, Giles and ViteAccess for having me here. ViteAccess has been a great partner with us in helping really shape the ecosystem around these digital measures. Because like Giles mentioned, we still have quite a lot to do in terms of making this easier and to drive adoption and all of that. And that's the purpose for which we set up DEEP. And DEEP stands for Digital Endpoint Ecosystem and Protocols. And here we are starting to tackle some of these new problems. I just want to emphasize that some of the things that are required to establish novel endpoints are exactly the same as they have always been for PROs and all of that. So you need to start with the conceptual framework of what is meaningful to be measured in any given disease. And those endpoint definitions are not digital. So endpoints themselves are not really digital. They are just what is meaningful to be measured. The instruments to measure those things can be digital. And why that is important is that in terms of the endpoints, that includes the interpretation of that particle measure in that given disease. So if you are measuring number of steps, the interpretation of that information is agnostic to how those steps are being measured. So you could measure them manually by observing them or by some digital tool. It doesn't really matter. The interpretation would be 100% the same. So what we're doing with DEEP is that we have created a digital environment for publishing those kinds of endpoint standards. So we can publish these definitions in a catalog where everybody can go in and see what are the meaningful concepts that can be measured in any given disease and find evidence supporting that definition. And that allows us to harmonize and align behind the same definition so that we don't end up having different standards for what should be measured and what the interpretation of that measure is any given disease. We don't want to end up with a Janssen definition or interpretation for any of these things. So this allows us to really harmonize and so on. The other thing that we publish in this digital environment is standards for the instrumentation to measure those things. But if you want to measure number of steps, there can be different techniques for measuring that. So using a wearable device of some sort, and then we can describe in these technical standards what sort of performance requirements there are for us to measure that with sufficient precision and reliability and all of those things. And any technology that can then meet those requirements can be determined to be equivalent and compatible with that particular standard. So that allows us to use different brands of technologies to measure different kinds of things, and allows us to also upgrade components of these technologies. So the life cycle of these measurement solutions is one of the key differences compared to other measurement tools like PROs. So once you create a PRO, that PRO doesn't change very often, whereas digital solutions change all the time. Algorithms can be self-learning, so they change basically all the time. And even the sensor technologies, the life cycle of a digital device today is less than 1 year. So we need to be able to upgrade and change. And sorry about my dogs, they wanted to add their opinions to this. So anyway, we publish those technical standards as well for the instruments. And then what we also do in the catalog is that we publish different measurement solutions and their components. So researchers can then go in and find algorithms and data sets and evidence supporting these different solutions, enabling really new ways of collaboration in the ecosystem. We can also then open a new pathway to the regulators to establish acceptance of these measures. So instead of embedding these measurement tools and evidence about them into our private briefing books, we can point the regulators and HTA bodies to come to this catalog and access all of that evidence in a published environment, where we can then share the scientific advice coming from the regulators and other parties, and basically have one conversation with the regulators, with the HTA bodies, with the patients, with the clinicians, so everybody can chime in about the different endpoints and tools and standards and things like that. So that's one thing that DEEP offers. The other thing that DEEP offers, if you go to the next slide, is a set of new services that we have designed together with companies like White Access. So with these new measures, there will be new expert and specialist services that will be required by companies like us to make this a bit more easy and accessible for different teams to execute through the development and validation of these novel measures. So just like in patient-reported outcomes, you see some specialist services like cognitive debriefing, linguistic validation, and these sort of things. Digital tools also need similar expert services for doing these kinds of things. Many companies, especially the smaller ones, are not very good at prototyping different technologies, for example. So once you have determined what you want to measure, the next step is then to start to figure out how can you measure that thing. And that often can include prototyping, where you may need to experiment with different algorithms, sensor technologies to find something that, that suits your needs. So that has been designed as a service that can be offered by different companies in the ecosystem. And I know that White Access does offer many of these services to their customers. And that's really important because these services can really lower the complexity of having to navigate through all of that. So we don't all have to be experts in this, because we can rely on actual experts like the White Access team to help us follow all the best practices, do these kind of things in a consistent way, and also to tease out those collaboration opportunities by having these connections into the ecosystem, into this kind of catalog that that everybody can access in the future. So we have designed these services and we have developed basically service protocols that are almost like SOPs for service providers that define the inputs and outputs of each of the services and some of the core elements of the services, but leaving lots of flexibility for different companies to implement those services and offer them in ways that fits their organization. But there's still consistency in the way that these services are performed within the community. So we try to improve the maturity and availability of services and make sure that this work is done in a consistent way. So I think that's really important to, drive adoption and make sure that everybody follows the best practices that are starting to emerge out of this. So the digital catalog and the collaboration environment is one of the key things from DEEP, and then these service protocols is the second big thing that we bring to the table. And this really has been done for the common good of the ecosystem. It is something Janssen has been leading, but we are really doing this for improving the ecosystem, and that's the key driver behind all of this. So we intend to make a lot of this publicly available to everybody. So stay tuned for more information on those things. But today, White Access is already very familiar with these services. So if you have need for any of these things, then White Access is a good party to talk to learn more about the details of what's involved there. So I don't know, Giles, if there anything else you want me to cover. That's basically all I wanted to say about DEEP. Giles, you're on mute, I think.
Okay, thanks, Kai. Yeah, so I'll pick up from here, and then we'll soon move into the Q&A. So yeah, we think there's significant value to be captured through the widespread use of digital endpoints and measures. We think they can be used very successfully as persuasively and compellingly within HTA. DEEP establishes a regular pathway for the development of digital endpoints and can be an accelerator for the adoption of digital measurement solutions across the healthcare sector. White Access has contributed to the development of DEEP from its early stages. How then can we help with regards to digital measurement, endpoints and measurements in HEOR? We can work with you to identify where there are opportunities to use digital measurement to enhance the evidence base and the value proposition of your new health technologies. We can partner with you to develop your overall strategy for clinical outcome assessment, including potential digital endpoints. And we can also provide a number of the defined DEEP services that we showed on the previous slide. And those will include services such as asset search, measurement definition, and we can do prototyping for specific mobile health solutions. We're familiar with the protocols across the DEEP stack. And so there are other aspects where in specific circumstances it would make sense to provide those services, and we'd be very happy to discuss that with you. And then finally, one thing we should also mention is that we are currently leading the development of a novel digital instrument that's using geofencing technology to measure healthcare resource utilization. And this is serving as a pilot of the overall DEEP framework. So what is that? So the new instrument uses GPS location data on a patient's smartphone to generate an alert when they visit a healthcare facility, that being a hospital, a clinic, or a GP practice. And then the date, the time, and the duration of the visit will be logged to the server, and then a survey is distributed to the patient's smartphone to gather more information about the visit and the treatment that they've received. So the combination of objective data on the visits and patient-reported data that's requested in a timely fashion is going to allow fast and flexible generation of evidence on a health resource utilization as an alternative to current traditional methods, including chart reviews and accessing claims databases. And so the final thing I'll say to round up is that the DEEP pilot is a collaborative project, and we're welcoming additional partners to the current development consortium that we have. So if this particular initiative is of interest to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch after the webinar. And that really brings us to the end of our presentation material. So really now we have some time for Q&A.
Excellent. So thanks Giles, thanks Kai. We've got some questions that have come in that we'll take you through. If anyone has additional questions, please keep firing them in. If we're not able to get through all of the questions in the time, we're happy to respond afterwards. And of course, if you have any questions afterwards, actually, you know, again, we'd be happy to discuss those. So there's a question for, I think it's for Kai, probably. You know, examples of digital endpoints that have been used in clinical trials, because I guess that's some of the background to this, the DEEP initiative, right? So what's happened in the past? Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Kai?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of examples, and a good source for finding out more about these would be the DIME digital endpoint library that you can find on the DIME website. That's a good overview of what is being used right now. Just some things that are close to me in terms of personal experience, some things that I find quite exciting. Like one good example is nocturnal scratch. So many diseases have issues where you have skin condition and people have to scratch their that particular part of the skin. So during the day, people don't seem to mind too much about that problem, but at night it can become very disturbing, when it will impact your sleep. And it's a good example, of the many different concepts of interest that are at play here. So you have the actual itch itself, and at night you have a number of scratching events where you might have to wake up and scratch. There's the duration of those events. There's the total duration that you spend scratching. Then you have the impact on sleep. So how long will it take you to fall asleep again after waking up? What's the total wake time at night? So when we talk to patients, they actually say that the scratch or the itching itself is something that's not too bad, but it's often the secondary effects, so the disturbance to their sleep and preventing them from doing other activities. That's often the thing that they care about about most. So these digital measures allow us to actually better understand which of these concepts are most meaningful to patients. So in terms of kind of how to validate something like that, you could do an experiment where you could deploy a PRO to ask patients about those different aspects and to measure those different aspects, and then try to find the correlations where the different concepts tend to be determined of which one of these are the most meaningful ones that most impact their daily lives. And then those are then the endpoints that you should probably use in your clinical trial, for example. A different example in Alzheimer's disease, that is a condition that is vastly underdiagnosed, where more than 50% of the people with the disease don't have any kind of diagnosis or any kind of access to any kind of treatment and so on. And often these people live in remote areas. They tend to be on the elderly side, living in the countryside, and there's no memory clinics nearby where you can just walk in and get some testing done. So enabling like remote access to cognitive testing, for example, through telemedicine or even telephone-based tools can bring this kind of diagnostics to people like that and bring them to care settings, bring them into research settings to increase the diversity and access to those kinds of opportunities is a different challenge. So that improves diversity and access to these people, and also can be much more effective in terms of resource utilization, because these can be sometimes fully automated, but you actually don't need a clinician, which is kind of a rate limiting factor in these kind of settings. And when the clinician is needed, they can remain in place while being able to do remote assessments with patients wherever they are without anybody having to travel. So they can see more patients that way. And through these kind of automated filtering techniques, we can funnel the right people to then see those clinicians for more advanced testing and things like that. So that's kind of an operational benefit on top of the other novel insights you can get extracts from these kind of testing things. So the benefits can be really quite multifold. And just earlier this week, I heard from a patient with ALS, where this patient says that it's a motor disease where they lose control of their muscles. So this patient was saying that before treatment, he wasn't able to write, he wasn't able to buckle his seatbelt in the car. And with this treatment, he can now write so that it's legible. He was very proud for being able to buckle his own seatbelt. And these are the kind of things that kind of matter to patients. But he said that despite that clear functional improvement in his life, the same rating scale that was being used to assess his condition was still reporting the same exact score. So in terms of, I'm greatly better than before, but the stupid score is still the same. So these tools can be much more sensitive. And this is like to a pharma company, for example, who's trying to develop product for the market and needs to establish this kind of evidence, this can be really transformative for us, because if we were using that conventional scale, it would be very difficult for us to show improvement. But if we use more of a functional scale, it can be much more sensitive in that kind of setting and easier for us to establish the evidence we need for authorization and all of that. So just wanted to highlight that these benefits extend to a range of stakeholders, pharma companies, patients, clinicians, payers, and all of that. So I think we have an obligation as a community to really improve access to these research tools and do what we can to advance the field forward. So thank you for doing your part with this webinar.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, one of the parts of the DEEP framework is, I mean, I think many people, hopefully many people on the webinar would recognise the potential, and Giles has taken us through, you know, given us a flavour of some of those, the potential scientific opportunities that these new types of measures offer. I guess perhaps the DEEP framework says, well, look, it doesn't need to be as scary as perhaps you thought it was, and ideally that development can be quicker than maybe certainly it has been historically, and perhaps a lot quicker than people anticipate. And of course, with fewer resources, no one's going to complain about that as well, of course. I've got a two-part question come in, which is essentially, I'm going to ask one part to Giles and then come back to Kai for the second part. Question is, how realistic is it to expect payers and regulators to recalibrate from existing familiar metrics to unfamiliar digital metrics, and how long is this going to take? So I'm going to ask Giles about that from a payer perspective. Maybe I'll come back to Kai to get his perspective on regulators. Giles?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to recognise the scale of the challenge. So there are established endpoints that payers are very much used to, and getting them to move away from that toolkit is going to take some degree of education, and they're going to need to have a good understanding of the new endpoints and to be able to compare them to their previous benchmarks. Now, a lot of that's going to come through the validation process, which is an important step of DEEP. So you'll be comparing the actual values that you're achieving with a new digital measurement to the scores or the values you were getting on old measures, and you'll be comparing the variability of the two. So that validation process is going to be important for payers. But, you know, there's also one thing that stepping back from that, there's also one thing that we need to remember is that actually with these new measures, it's not a like for like replacement. We are actually trying to measure something new. So the idea of using a digital measurement is to get closer to patients, to measure more of what is important to them in a setting that matters to them, and to do so continuously rather than, you know, in a very distinct period of time. So we do expect to see different results. And part of the process of the asset definition phase is making sure that what we're measuring with the digital measure is what matters most to patients, and we consult with stakeholders to get their perspective. So hopefully what we deliver at the end of this is something that's readily accepted as a measure which is accurately telling payers, clinicians, regulators about changes in a patient's condition.
Yeah, and so Kai, same sort of question, but for regulators. I mean, they're not typically known to be, well, let's say that perhaps often characterized a little bit conservative. So is that, how much of a challenge is that going to be with them?
I wouldn't actually say that they're conservative. I think they are actually very proactive in also doing their part. Like the FDA especially has been very active, vocal, and even pushing sometimes the industry to do more in this area. I think they have actually offered us pretty clear guidance, so we know what the rules are and all of that. I'm not sure if the message is getting across to everybody as effectively as I would like it to be, but I think they actually have done a pretty good job in clarifying those sort of things. But yeah, I think the legacy endpoints, some strategies and tactics that we can use to kind of coexist with them. One of them is that you can use the legacy endpoints, and you can sometimes even digitize these. So for example, in the cognitive testing space, many of these tools, you can deploy them remotely using telemedicine, for example, but then you can record the audio and the video stream and analyze them and extract sometimes hundreds of extra features, novel features that are, you still have the kind of classical score, but then on top of that, you have a full host of new features you can get out of the test. And you can then include both, and they can happily coexist. And the other strategy is that we can actually try to find correlations between the novel measures and the old ones. So if you have lots of legacy like benchmarks that you want to still be able to leverage from past research done, if we can somehow establish the bridge between the new measure and the old one, you can still enable these kind of comparisons to be made if you understand those correlations. So that is something that you can do as part of the validation process, is to use the conventional measures as anchors to understand how they might correlate with something that's been established in the past. The other thing we can do is to actually use a very data-driven approach. So CTTI has a very clever tool for endpoint evaluation. So they have 14 different criteria you can use to actually assess different endpoints. So the most important category being meaningfulness to patients. Second one is clinical meaningfulness, the unmet need clinically. There's burden to patients, to sites, and all of that. And can actually score these endpoints and quantify them. So that is one way to kind of how to quantify and compare endpoints. And if we start collecting that sort of data and also evidence from the real world about the clinical picture and why this new measure might be so much more relevant than the existing measure, it will become very difficult for regulators or any other party to argue that we should use the Stone Age tools when evidence clearly shows that they are inferior to what we want to do here. So we should try to bring forward this sort of evidence because it's a very science-driven, data-driven industry. So people usually follow the science, follow the evidence rather than opinions. So let's make sure that we do all the right things in the validation stages to generate this sort of evidence. I think that's the best way to convince stakeholders to then adopt.
Sort of a related follow-on questions come in, which is around just, I guess it's quite a general one about COVID. Does this impact? Is this, we read a lot about COVID accelerating technology use in various sorts. Are you seeing any of that already, Kai, with respect to this environment, people's willingness to use digital measures already?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this world has completely transformed. So everybody's thinking about remote trials, remote evidence generation, and all of that. And like almost overnight, kind of those operational models and these kind of tools went from a nice to have to something that everybody needs to think about. You need to think about how can you operate in the middle of a pandemic. If not this one, then the next one. So that's something that everybody will be investing to make sure that they are more ready for those sort of things. So those questions are now being asked by default and not as an afterthought. I think most companies in all of their key programs are thinking about digital evidence generation strategies. I think that's kind of very routinely done everywhere now, as far as I can see. So yeah, I mean, that's completely changed the picture. And I have a long history with this IMI protocol trials at home. It started before the pandemic started, and then the pandemic also had to change the thinking there quite a bit, and suddenly that project was kind of propelled to be very, very, very critical for the industry. So it also was challenging because then we also had to ramp up our thinking in terms of innovation, like just doing some basics about telemedicine wasn't going to cut it because everybody's doing telemedicine now. So we had to also push the innovation thinking to the next phase to think about what would this look like in the next 5 years and all of that. So yeah, there's been a lot of change in this space in the past 2 years.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, I mean, we have seen in the digital real-world evidence studies that we do, I mean, pretty strong engagement from participants over the pandemic period. Now, this is clearly multivariate, so you can't really, it's a correlation, so you need to explore a little bit what causes that. But certainly, almost our default is that we should be able to get pretty strong engagement, remote engagement with participants across different countries, etc. So I think that link to this suggests that there's a pretty, again, another great opportunity for using digital measures, developing digital measures, because we shouldn't neglect the patient, and they appear to be very open to this type of, remote data capture. Just conscious of time, Giles, question for you came in. You mentioned when you were talking about DEEP, how could anyone get involved in the DEEP program, or I guess the prototype that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, we encourage you to get in touch with us if you've got any interest in the detail of DEEP, either in the pilot that we're running on the geofencing enabled HRU instrument, but also if you want to learn more about the process itself and how it can be applied to a new digital endpoint or digital measure that you may be considering, we'd be very happy to engage with you and see how we may be able to help. So yeah, please get in touch directly with us at VitaAccess.
And I'd just to add to that, I suppose one point I'd make is that those the protocols that Kai mentioned, which are a key part of DEEP, it offers huge flexibility. So you don't have to start only at the beginning. So if people have already done some digital development work of a measure, they could still find significant value in looking at some of those protocols for the remaining steps. So again, that flexibility I think is a really nice part of it. So we'd be happy to share more if you want to get in touch about that.
And maybe, Mark, one thing to mention about how the protocols were created. So they already incorporate all of the best practices we were able to extract from the public domain. So the work coming out of DIME, coming out of CTTI, many of these other groups. So it's all been packaged into these protocols. So you don't have to read through 50 scientific papers to know what you're supposed to be doing. These protocols kind of package it up and distill it into very actionable format for providers like VitaAccess to actually execute these services according to all of the best practices that have been established there. So we try to kind of bring it all together into these protocols. So that's how they were created.
Yeah, and I'd just also say, I mean, Kai is too modest to say this, but I mean, there's a significant amount of work that went into those protocols. And so, we were involved in a part of that, but, Kai and his team were the I guess the gel that made that, brought the pieces together. And looking at those different protocols, I mean, there's such richness there. I think that if you didn't have experience of digital measures and were trying to do all of those necessary steps yourself from scratch, I mean, that's a pretty tough undertaking, and there's a time implication, there's a budget implication of that. So not to say it's impossible, but I mean, these are some great things that can help. And of course, as I said, they're free, so limited downside.
Yeah, it was thousands of hours. We had over 30 organizations partnering with us to create this. So we had startups, we had academia, we had regulators, we had other pharma companies, we had service providers. And yeah, it's literally thousands of hours that has gone into that. But the protocols are pretty straightforward. They are not 1,000 pages, even though we spent thousands of hours creating it. To be able to bring something to that sort of concise format actually is what takes the time.
Yeah.
So they are not that complex. They're pretty straightforward, very actionable, and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, look, I'm very conscious of time. I've gone a little bit over, so I'm going to draw things to a close there. Just to say finally that we're doing a series of these webinars, so there will be others later in the year that you can get in touch with. We'll be in touch with our sort of mailing list, etc. later in the year. I think the next one's probably going to be September. There are old ones. I think you can also access the recordings of old ones. Yeah, look forward to seeing you all again on the next one. So many thanks to our panelists. Thank you to Kai. Thank you to Giles for your insight, and wish everyone a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Yep, thank you. Bye-bye.